Assalamu alaikum, greetings. I was tasked with reading Mamdani's Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. This is an excellent article that highlights the perception in the West that Muslims are inherently backwards, culturally inferior, and, and inherently dangerous to democratic and Western values, and that the West has to constantly play the role of the uh, interrupter, the redesigner, the reformer of the Islamic world. And so the author Randani, he talks about several concepts related to this: the white man's burden, the view that the burden of the Western European to lift up the uh, barbarous third world nations, which we are still living with today. And so one of the most salient points about this article is he highlights how these concepts that we have ignore the cultural and historical realities that often generate the visions that we have of the people we love to hate. And so he decides to go into discussing the political histories of the clandestine operations of the CIA, and many of its operations destabilizing the Africa. And he speaks about the Contras, which are non-Muslim countries, but the typical uh, tactics of these organizations to undermine the ruling uh, people in those countries, or undermine, more importantly, the democratic values of those people, such as the Contras, the counter-revolutionaries in the global South and South America and South American, Latin American countries, fighting against the people who were fighting for freedom, even though under the guise of communism. So also, he speaks about the Angola and the CIA support for UNITA, even against Congress's will. Um, you know, giving millions of dollars to the UNITA, which was responsible for the deaths of many innocent civilians. And so he's highlighting basically this counter narrative about culture and bringing in the entire story that culture and politics often influence how we view the Muslim world. And so he goes even deeper into the Afghan Pakistan conflict and the Taliban, the creation of the Taliban, and the support, even before that, of the Mujahideen by the United States. In many cases, directly funding the terrorist organizations and bringing Muslims in from Southeast Asia and Central Asia, and parts of North Africa, such as Algeria, to literally serve as jihadists, and so they adopt the language of Islam and use the Islamic rhetoric to fight against the Soviets. So they really give them the language and encourage the language of jihad, and in many ways, as he points out in the article, quite saliently, the Cold War divided the Muslims in a sense. It fractured them around these kind of socio-political, economic conflicts. And so he goes even deeper and speaks about the drug trade in Afghanistan and how the CIA propped up and used the opium trade, and in a sense became one of the most central suppliers, Afghanistan, of the opium to the United States at a rate of 60% of the heroin coming into the United States was supplied by Afghanistan. And this is back in the 80s, 90s. And so in many believe it's still taking place today, which he doesn't mention. But more than likely, the evidence hasn't shown anywhere that it has stopped. So he goes even deeper in looking at the how the drug trade influenced the rest of Afghanistan, in many ways the rest of the world, and entrenched so that those rulers in those countries were forced to negotiate with these terrorists and accept things, accept the whatever kind of calls that for injustice that they were demanding. And he speaks also about the Taliban's growth out of being a protecting force into a terrorizing force after its experience uh, fighting the Soviets. That in its constant war and seeing the killing of and removal of its children in its week, eventually the Taliban became violent, is what he argues. And so he even speaks that, and he spoke to that one of the authors here asked about why the Taliban changed, and they said the shift of the forced gender equity of the communists to the forced misogyny of the Taliban, the combination of traditional male seclusion to the madrasas with the militarism of jihadi training, and finally, the fear of Taliban leaders that their members would succumb to rape, a practice for which the Mujahideen were notorious. So he mentions it's true the CIA did not create the Taliban, but the CIA did create the Mujahideen and embraced both bin Laden and the Taliban as alternatives to secular nationalism. So this is the essence, the essence of this article, and of course leading up to September 2011, 2001. He mentions up to September 10th, 2001, that the United States was compelling African countries to reconcile with terrorist movements. So literally a day before September 11th, United States and Britain were compelling African countries to reconcile with terrorist movements. And the demand was that governments must share power with terrorist organizations in the name of reconciliation. In Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and Angola, reconciliation turned into a code word for impunity, disguising a strategy for undermining hard-won state independence. And so it then begged to ask the question, well, who is responsible? Who is truly responsible for the narratives that we tell ourselves about the militant Islam or Islamofascism, or all these names that we've come up with in the West? What is the real story, the cultural and political histories that explain these movements, and how can we detach them from the narrative of good Westerner, bad Westerner? And indeed, we cannot, because a lot of these demons and these evils that we see originate here. And so we should instead, I think, arguably look at it from what he argues as good humans, bad humans, good people and bad people, and perhaps we can then gain a more nuanced understanding. Mamdani ends the article discussing how Muslims should, instead of creating a national political Islam, or the Muslim majority state, or an Islamic state is often coined, that Muslims should instead be careful of taking on the notion of statehood, which is a inherently Western point of view that's formed from what he's alluding to, the concept of statehood vis-a-vis the Treaty of Westphalia, which was created due to the conflicts in the church and different varying Christian factions vying for power in Europe. And so for Muslims to take this type of idea, and especially the maturation of those ideas to the present day phenomenon, with all the historicity that we talked about, the manipulation of other states through economic and subterfuge and uh, um, what we would call kind of clandestine means, is not something that Muslims should look forward to. But instead he suggests that we should create our own uh, movements, our own concepts of what nationhood should look like. And he states at the end, the test of democracy of multi-religious and multicultural societies is not simply to get the support of the majority of the nation, but to do so without losing the trust of the minority. And I'll end on the note that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says that he indeed offered the trust to the heavens and the earth, and they did not undertake it, but man, we undertook it, because we were indeed unjust and foolish. And so I think it's prescient, this is just my opinion, ending on this note, how Allah mentions that the trust is something that was offered to mankind, and this is the foundation of all nationhood, states, families, relationships, is the foundation of trust. And if this is undermined, whether we be Muslim or whether we be non-Muslim, whether it be, again, families or cities or nations, then the foundation will inevitably not hold. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.